Hello, this is Heather Meeker. I'm a lawyer and venture capitalist who specializes in open source software. This quick presentation will help you understand why most companies limit the use of LGPL software to dynamically linked libraries. LGPL is a copyleft license. If you need a refresher on what that means, take a look at my presentation on what is copyleft. This presentation is specifically about LGPL. Copyleft comes in a few flavors. GPL is sometimes called a strong copyleft license because it applies to all the code in a program. LGPL is a license that only applies to libraries of code, which are parts of programs. LGPL is sometimes referred to as library copyleft because it works well for code libraries. Lots of companies have open source use policies that only allow the use of LGPL code in dynamically linked libraries. Let's look into why. This is Section 4 of LGPL version 3. You might be using code under LGPL version 2.1, but the rules are nearly identical. Let's look at the requirements in detail now. It says you may convey a combined work under terms of your own choice, and goes on. A combined work is a software program that combines the software provided under LGPL, which I will call the library, with proprietary code. This clause says you can distribute the combined program under any terms you like, such as a proprietary license. So far, so good. But in order to take advantage of the terms of Section 4, Clause D gives you two choices. You have to do only one of them. The first requires you to provide the unlinked objects for your proprietary code, along with the source code for the library. Most companies don't like to do this because either they don't want to expose the object interface, or because it's just too much work. After all, unlinked objects are not usually considered a product, and most companies don't expect to make them available. The second choice is easier. You just have to use a shared library mechanism. In languages like C++, this means dynamic linking. Lots of high-level languages like Java or scripting languages don't really have any other way of integrating code. So for high-level code, this choice is a no-brainer. These two rules are necessary so that recipients of the code can truly exercise the rights they get. Static links combine objects into a program with one big binary blob that loads into memory all at once and stays there while the program executes. Dynamically linked libraries are only loaded into memory and executed by the main program when they are needed. So they may never be used at all. Have you ever run a program and gotten a DLL error? That means your program tried to find a dynamically linked library and it was not there. If you distribute statically linked binaries, then the recipient can't undo them and has to get the unlinked objects to your proprietary pieces and the source code for the library if the recipient wants to make changes to the library and relink the objects to create a program that will actually run. If you use dynamic linking instead, then that's not necessary because the executable program is already separated into dynamically linked objects, and the recipient can just replace the DLL and rebuild the program. People sometimes categorize LGPL as slightly stronger than licenses like the Mozilla public license, which has no rules about the methods of linking. This rule about LGPL is a good illustration of the difference between best practices and possible practices. A company does not need to limit its use of LGPL code to dynamically linked libraries. It's just a lot easier to operationalize that rule. And because so much code today is in high-level languages, it's not a difficult rule to follow. Now here's a small bonus topic. You may have noticed that Section 4 says you can distribute the combined program under a proprietary license, but that license can't restrict modifications of the library. In fact, most proprietary licenses contain a provision that conflicts with this requirement. Most proprietary software licenses include reverse engineering restrictions. Here's an example of what one might look like. If your license agreement covers your whole product, including the libraries, and imposes this restriction, then it is inconsistent with LGPL. By the way, it's also inconsistent with GPL, but the reverse engineering restriction is specifically a problem for LGPL. Because most software products these days include open source software, it's a good idea to include a carve-out in your proprietary license to account for the use of open source code. The highlighted portion here backs out the reverse engineering restriction to the extent necessary to comply with LGPL. That's the story for best practices in LGPL. But remember that any copyleft license also has the two basic conditions of copyleft. So for LGPL, you still have to make available changes to the source code for the library if you distribute binaries. And don't forget your license notices too. That's a requirement for all open source licenses. If you'd like to learn more about open source licensing, you might want to take a look at my book, Open Source for Business. You can download a free copy on my website if you follow instructions in the Links tab. I'm also a venture capitalist. I work with a fund called OSS Capital that specializes in early-stage commercial open source companies. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. This is Heather Meeker, signing off.